The divorce papers sat beside the ultrasound photo on the marble countertop, both documents declaring futures neither of them had planned for. Kael didn't reach for either one. He just stared at the city lights bleeding through the floor-to-ceiling windows of their penthouse, wondering when exactly the silence between them had become louder than any argument ever could.
I stopped counting the nights. He came home smelling like someone else's cologne around the 4th month of my pregnancy. The scent was always different, vanilla one week, sandalwood the next, but the pattern was the same. He'd slip into bed hours after I'd given up waiting, and I'd lie there with my hand on my stomach, feeling our son kick against my palm while his father slept an ocean away on the other side of the mattress. I didn't cry when I signed the first draft. I only checked the due date, both on the legal documents and the medical ones. 8 weeks until the baby arrived. 6 weeks until the divorce could be finalized if he didn't contest it. The mathematics of ending a marriage felt cleaner than I expected. All neat columns and required signatures. Nothing like the slow bleed of realizing you'd married a man who could build an empire but couldn't remember the last time he'd asked how you slept. The Omega had stopped speaking first. That was the part Darnell would never know because he'd stopped listening long before that. Kael had tested it one morning over breakfast, sitting across from his husband in their pristine kitchen that always smelled like expensive coffee and emotional distance. He'd mentioned a doctor's appointment. Then he'd mentioned thinking about names. Then he'd said he was considering moving to the guest wing. Darnell had nodded at all 3 statements without looking up from his tablet, his thumbs moving across the screen in that particular rhythm that meant he was handling something important. Something more important than the person carrying his child.
That's when Kael knew. Not suspected. Knew. Hi viewers. Have you ever had to compete for attention with someone's phone and realized you were losing? The pregnancy hadn't been planned, but Kael had wanted it the moment he saw those 2 lines. He'd imagined telling Darnell over dinner at that restaurant they used to go to before the empire got too big, before every meal became a working dinner. Instead, he'd mentioned it during a car ride between meetings, and Darnell had squeezed his hand once, said something about adjusting their security detail, and gone back to his phone call. That was 3 months ago. They hadn't discussed it since. Kael had built 40% of Darnell's infrastructure. He knew this because he designed it brick by digital brick, creating systems that made the organization run like water through pipes. Invisible, essential, completely taken for granted. He'd done it quietly, the way he did everything, because Darnell's world was loud enough for both of them. The Mafia boss needed handlers and executors, not partners. Kael had understood this. He'd accepted it. He'd even thrived in it for a while, finding power in being the calm at the center of Darnell's particular storm. But somewhere between the 3rd mistress and the 5th missed dinner, Kael had stopped finding poetry in the tragedy of loving someone who'd confused possession with partnership. The lawyer's office had smelled like leather and old paper. Kael had chosen the firm carefully. Discreet, expensive, specializing in high-net-worth dissolutions. The attorney, a sharp-eyed woman named Simone, had looked at the list of assets Kael had prepared and let out a low whistle. "You helped build all this?" She'd asked. Kael had nodded. "Then let's make sure you're protected," she'd said, and for the first time in months, someone had treated Kael's contributions like they mattered. The papers had arrived on a Tuesday. Kael knew this because he'd specifically requested Tuesday delivery. Darnell always kept his Tuesdays light, which meant he'd be home, which meant he'd be with her. The current one, the one who'd lasted longer than the others, the one who'd started leaving lipstick marks on shirt collars, Kael had stopped checking months ago. The penthouse felt like a museum sometimes. Beautiful, expensive, full of things that weren't meant to be touched. Kael moved through it like a ghost, his reflection caught in chrome and glass surfaces, his pregnant belly the only proof he still existed in 3 dimensions. He'd stopped eating in the dining room, stopped working in the office they'd once shared, stopped sleeping in their bed except when absolutely necessary for appearances. Darnell had noticed none of it. The organization's quarterly reports were starting to show strain. Kael noticed it in the revenue projections, in the delayed shipments, in the communication breakdowns between departments. He'd always been the one to catch these things, to smooth them over before they became problems. But he'd stopped doing that 2 weeks ago. Not as sabotage, as withdrawal. If Darnell wanted to run an empire without acknowledging the person who'd helped him build it, then Darnell could learn what that empire looked like without maintenance. Their son would be named Amari. Kael had decided this alone, sitting in the doctor's office during another appointment Darnell had missed. The ultrasound technician had asked if Dad was running late, and Kael had smiled that practice smile he'd perfected over the years and said, "He's handling something important." It wasn't even a lie. Everything was more important than this, than them, than the family they were supposed to be becoming. The truth settled in Kael's chest like winter. He wasn't divorcing Darnell because of the affairs. He was divorcing him because Darnell had stopped noticing when Kael stopped speaking, and that was somehow worse than any betrayal. At least betrayal required acknowledgement. This was just absence. The slow fade of a man who'd convinced himself that providing security meant he didn't need to provide presence. Kael had written one line on the petition, in his own handwriting at the bottom of page 12. "I refuse to raise our son in a house where love feels borrowed." His attorney had asked if he was sure he wanted to include it. Personal touches in legal documents were unusual. But Kael needed Darnell to know this wasn't impulse. This was the endpoint of 1,000 small abandonments, each one tiny enough to ignore until they'd accumulated into an absence shaped exactly like their marriage. The papers were being delivered at sunset. Kael knew because he'd specified the time. He wanted Darnell to be reading them while the city turned gold, in that particular light that made everything look beautiful and temporary. He wanted the woman to be there too. The envelope arrived exactly at 7:18, carried by a courier in a black uniform who didn't make eye contact. Darnell signed for it without looking at the return address, his attention split between the woman on his sofa and the city turning amber outside his windows.
Nia had been with him for 6 months, long enough to keep a toothbrush in his bathroom, not long enough to ask questions about the wedding ring he still wore. She was beautiful in that specific way Darnell gravitated toward. Sharp cheekbones, sharper ambition, the kind of woman who understood that power was currency and attachment was liability. She'd laughed when the courier interrupted them, made some joke about Darnell's work following him everywhere. He'd smile because that's what the moment required. The envelope sat on the glass coffee table between them, cream-colored and official. Nia reached for her wine glass, her fingers brushing Darnell's thigh in that casual way that usually preceded them moving to the bedroom. But Darnell was staring at the envelope, not at the return address, at the scent, lavender. The specific organic lavender oil Kael ordered from that boutique in Paris, the one he used on his pulse points, the one that used to cling to their sheets before Darnell had started sleeping in the guest room more nights than not.
"You going to open that? Or should I be jealous?" Nia's voice was playful, but there was an edge underneath. She'd learned to read Darnell's silences. Most people had. His hands moved automatically, breaking the seal, pulling out the document. The words reorganized themselves in his vision. Petition for dissolution of marriage. Joint custody arrangement pending. Asset distribution schedule attached. And there, at the bottom of page 12, in Kael's precise handwriting, "I refuse to raise our son in a house where love feels borrowed." The room tilted slightly, not in any way Nia would notice. Darnell had spent 34 years learning how to keep his face empty when the ground disappeared beneath him. But something in his chest cracked, hairline and complete, the way glass fractures before it shatters. "Work thing?" Nia asked. "Yeah." His voice came out normal. That was good. Normal was the goal. Just some contracts that need reviewing. He set the papers down carefully, face down, as if hiding the words would change what they said. Nia moved closer, her hands sliding up his arm, her lips finding the spot below his ear that usually made him forget whatever he was thinking about. And for a moment, Darnell let her. Let the familiar pattern of seduction and response take over. Let muscle memory override the words still burning in his peripheral vision. But when she kissed him, he tasted something wrong. Not her lipstick. Not the wine they'd been drinking. Something inside his own mouth, bitter and final. like swallowing the truth of something he'd been successfully ignoring for months. Our son. Darnell hadn't let himself think about the pregnancy in concrete terms. He'd absorbed it as information: adjust security, increase medical coverage, add beneficiaries to relevant accounts. But he hadn't thought about it as a person, as his son. As someone who would exist outside of quarterly reports and risk assessments, who would have Kael's eyes and Darnell's name and opinions about whether his parents loved each other. Nia's fingers traced patterns on his chest. The sunset had finished, leaving the city in that blue moment before the lights took over. Darnell could see their reflection in the window. Beautiful people in a beautiful room, playing at intimacy in the space between more important things. When had Kael started looking at them like this? From the outside, from the place where love becomes observation. "You're distracted," Nia murmured against his collarbone. It wasn't quite a complaint. "Thinking about work. You're always thinking about work." She pulled back, studying his face with that particular intelligence that had attracted him to her in the first place. "That's what I like about you. Single-minded. Uncomplicated." The word landed wrong. Uncomplicated. Like his life was clean lines and clear hierarchies. Like he hadn't built everything he had on the foundation of a man he'd stopped looking at directly somewhere around the 3rd year of their marriage. Kael had been 23 when they met. Too young for Darnell's world. Too soft for the kind of life Darnell was offering. But he'd proven everyone wrong, including Darnell. He'd learned the business faster than most of Darnell's lieutenants, implemented systems that saved millions in operational costs, handled crisis management with the kind of cold clarity that made grown men uncomfortable. And he'd done it all quietly, never demanding credit, never positioning himself as competition. Darnell had married him because it made strategic sense. Binding loyalty, secured succession, the kind of partnership that looked good in the structure of an organization that valued legacy. He'd loved him because Kael had looked at Darnell like he was more than the sum of his violence. Because in a world where everyone wanted something, Kael had only ever wanted him. When had that stopped being enough? Nia shifted, reaching for her phone. The moment broke. Darnell stood, crossing to the window, putting distance between himself and the envelope that was somehow louder than any argument they'd ever had. Kael didn't argue. That was the problem. He just got quieter and quieter until he disappeared entirely, and Darnell had been too busy running an empire to notice when the absence became permanent. "I should go," Nia said, reading the room. She was good at that, knowing when to press and when to retreat. "Early meeting tomorrow." Darnell nodded, not turning around. He heard her gather her things, felt her kiss on his shoulder blade, listened to the door close behind her with a soft, expensive click. Then he was alone with the envelope. He picked it up again, reread the handwritten line, tried to remember the last time he'd asked Kael how he was feeling. Not about the pregnancy, about anything. Tried to remember the last real conversation they'd had that wasn't logistics and scheduling. Tried to remember when he'd stopped seeing Kael as a person and started seeing him as a function. The answer was he couldn't remember. It had been too gradual, too easy. His phone buzzed. Marcus, his second, asking about tomorrow's meeting. Darnell typed a response, watched the message send, watched his reflection in the screen look back at him with eyes that suddenly seemed like a stranger's. The city glittered below. Somewhere in it, Kael was probably packing, or preparing, or doing whatever people did when they decided to stop being married to someone who'd forgotten how to see them. Darnell looked down at the divorce papers one more time, at the custody arrangement, at the due date for the baby he'd treated like a footnote, at the signature line waiting for his response. His phone buzzed again. Nia, texting goodnight with an emoji he didn't have the energy to decode. He stared at the message, thought about all the other messages like it, all the other women like her, all the ways he'd filled the spaces that should have been occupied by the man he'd promised forever to. Then he did something he hadn't done in 6 months. The sonogram from week 20 sat in Kael's desk drawer, buried under insurance documents and outdated contracts. He'd stopped carrying it in his wallet after Darnell had seen it there and said, "You should keep that somewhere safe." as if Kael's wallet wasn't safe. As if what Darnell really meant wasn't somewhere I don't have to look at it. The infrastructure Kael had built was elegant in its simplicity. Supply chain management that could reroute in real time. Communication networks that never left trails. Financial systems that moved money like water, finding new paths, always flowing, never stuck. He designed it all during the second year of their marriage, when Darnell's operation was expanding faster than his organizational capacity could handle. Back when Darnell used to sit with him at the kitchen table, explaining problems, asking for input, treating Kael like the partner he was supposed to be. The irony wasn't lost on Kael. He'd made Darnell's empire so efficient that Darnell no longer needed him to run it. The lawyer's office had become familiar over the past 3 weeks. Simone had a way of asking questions that felt like permission to tell the truth. "When did you start feeling invisible?" she'd asked during their second meeting. Kael had opened his mouth to say something diplomatic and instead heard himself say, "When I realized I could redesign his entire logistics network and he'd thank his senior analyst instead of me. When I started gaining weight from the pregnancy and he stopped looking at me during sex. When I scheduled a dinner to tell him we were having a boy and he canceled because a shipment got delayed." Simone had written everything down in her yellow legal pad. Then she'd looked up and said, "We're going to build you a new infrastructure. One where you're not invisible." That's how it started. Not with revenge. With architecture. Kael had begun with the financial review. Nothing illegal. Everything he did was technically within his authority as Darnell's spouse and co-manager of certain operational accounts. He just started redirecting. Moving shared assets into protected trusts for Amari. Restructuring joint accounts into separate holdings. Creating legal barriers that would take months to untangle, each one documented and defensible. Then he'd started with the operational side. He stopped offering solutions in the twice-weekly strategy meetings he still attended. When department heads brought him problems, which they did, constantly, because Kael had been solving their problems for years, he'd smile and say, "Have you talked to Darnell about that?" And then he'd watch as small inefficiencies compounded into larger ones, as communication breakdowns that he used to prevent started causing actual delays. He wasn't sabotaging anything. He was just no longer preventing the natural entropy that came with running an organization this complex. Turned out, Darnell's empire had been depending on Kael's invisible labor more than anyone, including Darnell, had realized. The pregnancy appointments were the hardest. Kael had stopped inviting Darnell after the third missed ultrasound. His doctor, Dr. Chun, had stopped asking where his husband was around the same time. They developed a routine. Kael would arrive, get checked, listen to Amari's heartbeat, and Dr. Chun would print extra copies of everything without being asked. "For your records," she'd say, which they both knew meant, "in case you need evidence later." At 24 weeks, Dr. Chun had found something concerning. Not dangerous, but requiring monitoring. A slight irregularity in Kael's blood pressure, stress-related, manageable with rest and reduced anxiety. She'd recommended cutting back on work. Kael had laughed. Not because it was funny, because the idea of explaining to Darnell that stress was affecting the pregnancy would require Darnell to acknowledge the pregnancy existed in the first place. He'd gone home that night and found Darnell in the shower. Had stood outside the bathroom door, hand raised to knock, mouth full of words about blood pressure and bed rest and needing help. Then he'd heard Darnell's phone ring from the bedroom. Heard him get out of the shower to answer it. Heard him say, "Hey, beautiful," in that particular voice he used to use for Kael. Kael had walked away, made himself dinner, eaten alone, gone to bed. The next morning, he'd called Simone and said, "I'm ready to file." The worst part wasn't the affairs. Kael had made peace with those somewhere around month 4 of his pregnancy, when he'd stopped being able to see his own feet and Darnell had stopped being able to see him. The worst part was the normalization of it all. The way everyone in their circle had just adjusted to the idea that Darnell had a wife at home and someone else in his bed. The way his lieutenants had learned to schedule around Darnell's personal time. The way the household staff had started asking Kael if he needed anything with this particular gentleness that meant they knew and pitted him. Sometimes the worst injustice isn't loud. It's just the way things are. Kael had started moving funds on a Tuesday. Small amounts at first, just testing the systems he'd built to see if anyone would notice. No one did. He moved larger amounts, restructured accounts, created trusts, built an entirely new financial infrastructure for himself and Amari, and not a single person in Darnell's organization caught it because Kael had designed the original system to be so smooth that no one actually monitored it anymore. By week 27 of his pregnancy, Kael had secured enough assets to be comfortable. Not wealthy by Darnell's standards, but stable, protected. His lawyer had been impressed. Most people in your position try to take everything out of anger, Simone had said. You're just taking what you're owed. I built 40% of his operation, Kael had replied. I'm taking 40% of our shared assets. That's not revenge. That's mathematics. The operations started stalling in week 28. Small things at first. Shipments arriving late, communications getting crossed, deals taking longer to close. Nothing catastrophic. Just friction where there used to be flow. Darnell's senior team started bringing it up in meetings, asking what had changed, trying to identify the bottleneck. Kael sat in those meetings, his hands folded over his belly, and said nothing, because he hadn't changed anything. He'd just stopped fixing everything. Darnell finally noticed in week 29. Caught Kael after a meeting, pulled him aside, asked, "Is something wrong with the logistics network?" And Kael had looked at his husband. Really looked at him, maybe for the first time in months, and said, "I wouldn't know. I haven't been managing logistics for weeks." Darnell had blinked. "Since when?" "Since you stopped asking me to." The confusion on Darnell's face had been genuine. He truly didn't know. Didn't know that Kael had been holding the entire infrastructure together. Didn't know that what looked like a self-sustaining system was actually one person, working constantly, making sure everything flowed smoothly. Didn't know that person was Kael. That's when Kael had realized. Darnell hadn't just stopped seeing him as a partner. Darnell had stopped seeing him as functional. He'd been reclassified somewhere along the way, from essential to decorative, from operator to dependent. The divorce papers had been filed the next day. Now, 3 weeks later, Kael sat in the penthouse that no longer felt like home, waiting for Darnell to realize what had already happened. The empire was starting to crack. Not collapse, Kael hadn't sabotaged anything. But the stress fractures were showing. Revenue was down. Communications were slower. Deals were falling through. And Darnell was starting to look tired in a way he never had before. Like he was carrying weight he didn't know existed until it was entirely on his shoulders. Kael's phone buzzed. His lawyer. The papers were delivered. "How are you feeling?" Kael looked around the penthouse. At the furniture he'd chosen. At the art he'd selected. At the home he'd built for a family that had never actually lived here. "Ready," he typed back. His hand moved to his belly, where Amari was doing what felt like somersaults. Active baby. Strong. Dr. Chun said that was a good sign. Kael had learned to find good signs where he could. The sun was setting. Darnell would be home soon. Or not home. With her. With whoever. It didn't matter anymore. Kael had already left. The divorce papers were just making it official. He just wondered how long it would take Darnell to notice the real changes. Not the legal ones. The operational ones. The slow unraveling of an empire that had been held together by someone Darnell had forgotten to value. The answer came faster than expected. Darnell's senior analyst presented the quarterly projections with the kind of careful neutrality that meant the numbers were worse than they looked. Revenue down 8%. Operational delays up 15%. Client satisfaction metrics trending downward for the first time in 3 years. The conference room stayed silent while Marcus pulled up the comparative data, and the silence got heavier when everyone saw the exact moment the decline had started. 12 weeks ago, right when Kael had stopped attending the operations meetings. Darnell sat at the head of the table, his face giving away nothing. He'd learned a long time ago that leadership meant never looking surprised, even when the ground was actively disappearing beneath you. But his mind was running calculations, trying to understand how an empire he'd built with his own hands could start fracturing the moment one person stepped back. Except Kael hadn't just been one person. That was becoming clear now. What changed? Darnell asked, his voice even. Marcus pulled up another slide. Best we can tell, nothing systematic. But response times have increased across all departments. The logistics network is still functional, but it's not optimizing anymore. Communications are taking longer. Small inefficiencies are compounding. Why? Marcus hesitated. We're not entirely sure. The systems are the same. The protocols haven't changed. It's like... He stopped. Like what? Like we used to have someone troubleshooting problems before they became problems, and now we don't. The words settled into the room. Darnell thought about Kael sitting in these meetings for years, his laptop open, his attention split between the presentation and whatever he was handling in the background. Darnell had assumed he was half listening. Had never considered that Kael might be actively managing 6 different crises simultaneously while pretending to take notes. Get the operations team to run a full diagnostic, Darnell said. I want to know every bottleneck, every delay, every point of failure. Marcus nodded. The meeting dissolved. Everyone filed out except Darnell, who sat alone in the conference room, staring at the revenue projections like they were written in a language he'd forgotten how to read. His phone buzzed. Nia, dinner tonight? He stared at the message. Thought about the divorce papers that had been sitting on his dresser for 3 days, untouched. Thought about Kael, who he hadn't seen since that brief conversation after the logistics meeting. Thought about the way his entire organization was apparently held together by someone he'd stopped paying attention to. Can't, he typed back. Work. He sent the message. Felt nothing. That was new. At home, the penthouse was empty in a way it hadn't been before. Not physically. All of Kael's things were still there, his books on the shelves, his clothes in the closet. But something essential had been removed, and Darnell couldn't name what it was. He walked through rooms that suddenly felt like they belonged to someone else. Stopped in the office they used to share. Kael's desk was clean. Too clean. Everything filed away, nothing personal, like a hotel room staged to look lived in. Darnell opened the drawer. Found the sonogram image he didn't know Kael had been keeping there. 20 weeks. The image was grainy, black and white, impossible to interpret unless you knew what you were looking at. But there was a notation in the corner in Kael's handwriting. Amari, our son. Week 20. Our son. Darnell sat down at Kael's desk, still holding the sonogram. Tried to remember the exact moment Kael had told him they were having a boy. Couldn't. Could remember exactly where he'd been when the deal with the Chicago pipeline had closed. Could remember the precise details of the territory negotiation with the East Side families. Could not remember his husband telling him the gender of their child. The apartment door opened. Darnell's body tensed automatically. Threat assessment, position advantage, exit routes. Then relaxed when he heard Kael's familiar footsteps. Measured, deliberate. The walk of someone who'd learned to move through dangerous spaces without drawing attention. Kael appeared in the office doorway. 7 months pregnant now, wearing one of those expensive maternity shirts that managed to look professional and comfortable simultaneously. He stopped when he saw Darnell sitting at his desk. I'm just picking up some files, Kael said. Polite, distant. The voice he used with subordinates. You've been staying at a hotel? It's more convenient. Darnell set down the sonogram. We need to talk. We really don't. Kael moved to the filing cabinet, pulled out a folder. His movements were efficient, practiced, someone completing a task they'd done 1,000 times. The operations are falling apart. No, they're not. They're just not being propped up anymore. Kael didn't look at him. There's a difference. You've been managing more than I realized. Yes. Why didn't you tell me? Now Kael looked at him. His eyes were the same color they'd always been, that particular amber that looked gold in certain light, but something in them had shifted. Distance. The kind you can't cross by wanting to. I did tell you, Kael said quietly. Multiple times. You just weren't listening. Darnell opened his mouth. closed it. Couldn't actually remember Kael telling him anything, which meant either Kael was lying or Darnell had stopped processing information that came from him. The second option felt more likely and worse. I'll fix this, Darnell said. Fix what? The operations? The marriage? Kael's voice stayed level. You can't fix something you don't understand is broken. I understand now. No, you understand that your revenue is down. That's different. The words landed like physical blows. Darnell stood, crossed the room, stopped when Kael held up a hand. Don't, Kael said. Don't what? Don't start paying attention now because your business metrics are suffering. Don't suddenly see me because the infrastructure is cracking. His hand moved to his stomach, an unconscious protective gesture. I needed you to see me when everything was fine, when I was managing everything perfectly and you still couldn't be bothered to ask how my day was. I'm asking now. It's too late. The finality in Kael's voice was worse than anger would have been. Anger could be worked with. This was just done. The baby has a name, Kael interrupted. Amari. I picked it at the 20-week appointment. The one you missed, along with all the others. Darnell felt something crack in his chest. I want to be there, at the birth, as his father. You'll have that right. Legally. Kael pulled out another file. The custody arrangement is generous. You'll see him regularly. You'll be in his life. But not yours. No. Kael looked at him directly now. Not mine. Because of Nia? Because I'll end it. Right now. It's not about her. Kael's voice was gentle, which was somehow worse than if he'd been angry. It's about the fact that you thought you could have her and me simultaneously and I just accept it because I loved you. It's about the fact that you stopped choosing me so long ago that you don't even remember when it happened. I choose you now. You choose your failing operations. You choose damage control. That's different. Kael collected his files, moved toward the door, stopped in the doorway without turning around. You were terrifying to everyone in your organization, he said quietly. Everyone except me. I just wanted to be chosen. That's all it would have taken. Just being chosen. Then he was gone. Darnell stood alone in the office, holding a sonogram of a son he'd barely acknowledged, in a penthouse that had stopped feeling like home, running an empire that was apparently falling apart without the one person he'd stopped seeing. His phone buzzed. Marcus. The board wants an emergency meeting. They're concerned about the operational decline. Darnell looked at the message, at the sonogram, at the empty doorway where Kael had been standing. For the first time in his adult life, he had absolutely no idea how to fix what he'd broken. The envelope from the board arrived on a Thursday morning, delivered by courier to Darnell's office rather than his home. That alone told him everything he needed to know about how serious this was. The board didn't communicate directly unless they were preparing to do something that couldn't be undone. Inside, a formal request for an emergency session to review leadership stability. Not leadership competence. Stability. They were questioning whether he was fit to run the organization. Marcus stood in the doorway, his face carefully neutral. You knew this was coming. I knew the numbers were bad. I didn't know they were this bad. It's not just the numbers. Marcus came in, closed the door. There's talk about your personal situation affecting your judgment. Darnell looked up sharply. Who's talking? Everyone. You're going through a divorce while your spouse is pregnant. You're visibly distracted. Operational metrics are declining in exact correlation with your marital problems. Marcus sat down across from him. They're not wrong to be concerned. My personal life is affecting your professional capacity. That's literally what they're saying, and they have data to back it up. Marcus pulled out his tablet, showed Darnell a spreadsheet. This is your decision-making response time over the last 6 months. See how it's increasing? These are the deals you've personally overseen. See how the close rate is declining. These are the disciplinary actions you've had to take because of communication breakdowns. Notice a pattern? Darnell looked at the data. The pattern was obvious. Everything had started declining the moment his marriage had started fracturing. Kael was managing more than I realized, he said quietly. Kael was managing everything you didn't want to deal with, and now he's not, and it's showing. Marcus leaned back. The board knows this. They're going to ask you to step back temporarily, voluntarily, while you get your house in order. And if I don't, they'll vote you out. They have the authority. And right now, they have the cause. The words settled into the room like stones. Darnell had built this organization from the ground up, had made decisions other people couldn't stomach, had created an empire that ran on discipline and fear and absolute certainty of hierarchy. And now that empire was preparing to remove him because he'd forgotten to pay attention to the one person holding it all together. His phone buzzed. Nia. He ignored it. When's the meeting? Darnell asked. Next week. Tuesday. The papers had been delivered on a Tuesday. Kael had filed for divorce on a Tuesday. Apparently Tuesdays were when Darnell's life fell apart. At the hotel where Kael had been staying, a boutique place downtown, expensive but discreet, Darnell stood outside the door to room 412, his hand raised to knock. He'd gotten the room number from the front desk by implying it was an emergency, which it was, just not the kind they'd assumed. Kael opened the door on the second knock. He was in comfortable clothes, his belly pronounced at 7 months, his hair slightly disheveled like he'd been resting. He looked at Darnell without surprise. The board is reviewing your leadership, Kael said. Not a question. How did you know? Because I filed a compliance concern 3 weeks ago, documenting the operational decline and my concerns about organizational stability. Kael stepped back, let Darnell in. You should read your internal memos more carefully. The hotel room was smaller than their penthouse but somehow felt more lived in. Kael's laptop on the desk, his books on the nightstand, a pile of baby clothes on the chair waiting to be folded. You filed a complaint against me? Darnell tried to keep his voice level. I filed a compliance concern. It's not the same thing. I documented facts. The board drew their own conclusions. You're trying to remove me. I'm protecting our son's inheritance. Kael sat down on the bed, his hand moving to his belly. If you drive the organization into the ground because you're too distracted to lead, Amari loses his financial security. I'm not letting that happen. Darnell stared at him, at this person he'd married, had thought he knew, had apparently never understood at all. This is revenge, he said. This is strategy. Kael's voice was calm. You taught me that. The difference between emotional response and calculated action. I'm just applying what you taught me. I never taught you to destroy me. You're destroying yourself. I'm just documenting it. The truth of that settled into Darnell's bones. He'd been so busy running an empire that he hadn't noticed his empire was running on the unpaid labor of someone he'd relegated to decoration. And now that person had stopped working for free, and everything was collapsing, and Darnell had no one to blame but himself. What do you want? He asked. Nothing from you. That's not true. Everyone wants something. Kael looked at him with those amber eyes that used to look at him like he was remarkable. Now they just looked tired. I wanted you to notice when I stopped talking, Kael said quietly. I wanted you to ask why I started sleeping in the guest room. I wanted you to care that I was going to doctor's appointments alone. I wanted you to choose me over your phone, over your work, over the women who made you feel powerful without asking you to be present. He paused. I don't want those things anymore. I just want you to sign the papers and let me build a life where I'm not constantly disappearing. I see you now. You see your failing metrics. It's not the same thing. Darnell moved closer. Kael didn't move away, but he didn't move toward either. Just sat there, pregnant with their son, looking at Darnell like he was a stranger he used to know. Tell me how to fix this, Darnell said. You can't. That's what you're not understanding. Kael's voice was gentle. Some things can't be fixed. They can only be grieved and learned from. I don't accept that. You're going to have to. A knock on the door interrupted them. Kael stood, moving with the careful balance of someone carrying extra weight. Opened it to reveal a woman Darnell recognized, Simone, the attorney. She had a folder in her hand and hesitated when she saw Darnell. "Should I come back?" she asked Kael. "No, we're done." Kael took the folder. "Thank you." Simone left. Kael opened the folder, pulled out a document, handed it to Darnell. Medical power of attorney, birth plan, emergency contacts, all the documents someone would need if they were planning to give birth without their spouse present. "You're not putting me down as your emergency contact," Darnell said, hearing how his voice sounded. "Lost, young, nothing like the man who ran an empire. You'll be listed as the father. But my emergency contact is my lawyer. She'll actually answer when the hospital calls." The words were meant to hurt. They succeeded. Darnell set the documents down. "I ended it. With Nia. With all of them. Good for you. Doesn't that matter? It would have mattered 6 months ago. Now it's just damage control." Kael moved to the window looking out at the city. "You're not ending it because you realized it was wrong. You're ending it because your board is questioning your leadership and your revenue is declining. That's not transformation. That's strategy. What's the difference? Transformation happens when everything is fine and you choose to be better anyway. Strategy happens when everything is broken and you're trying to minimize loss." Kael turned to face him. His hand rested on his belly, where Amari was presumably doing whatever 7-month fetuses did. "The board meeting is Tuesday," Kael said. "I recommend you attend prepared to step back voluntarily. It'll look better than being forced out. You're really going to let them remove me. I'm really going to let you face the consequences of your choices. There's a difference." Darnell stood there, in a hotel room that his husband had been living in for weeks without him noticing, holding documents that proved exactly how irrelevant he'd become in his own family, and finally understood what Kael had been trying to tell him. This wasn't about revenge. It was about survival. And Kael had learned from the best. "When's the baby due?" Darnell asked quietly. 6 weeks. "Will you let me be there?" Kael was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know yet." It wasn't no. It wasn't yes. It was honest. Darnell nodded, left the hotel room, stood in the hallway for a full minute before he could make himself move toward the elevator. His phone buzzed. The board meeting had been moved up. Monday instead of Tuesday. They weren't even giving him time to prepare. He thought about calling Marcus, calling his attorney, calling someone who could help him strategize his way out of this. Instead, he stood in the hotel hallway, finally understanding that some problems couldn't be strategized away. Some problems you just had to live through and hope you survived them. And some people you lost not because they stopped loving you, but because you stopped showing up until they had no choice but to learn to live without you. The boardroom went silent when Darnell walked in alone. No Marcus flanking him. No attorneys buffering the space between him and consequence. Just Darnell carrying a single folder, wearing the kind of exhaustion that made expensive suits look cheap. 12 board members sat around the mahogany table. Darnell had appointed 7 of them personally, had saved 3 of them from federal investigations, had made all of them wealthy beyond what they'd imagined possible. And now they were looking at him like he was a liability they needed to calculate around. "Thank you for coming," said Jerome, the board chair. His voice had that particular corporate gentleness that preceded termination. "We wanted to discuss the operational concerns that have been raised." Darnell set the folder down. Inside was every mistake he'd made in the last 6 months, documented in Kael's precise handwriting. Revenue reports, communication breakdowns, delayed responses. The mathematical proof that he'd been failing while thinking he was succeeding. "I know why you called this meeting," Darnell said. "You want me to step back." Jerome glanced at the others. "We're concerned about organizational stability during a period of personal transition for you." Personal transition. Darnell almost laughed. "That's a diplomatic way of saying my husband is divorcing me while pregnant and I didn't notice our entire infrastructure was falling apart." The bluntness made several board members shift uncomfortably. They were used to Darnell's control. This raw honesty was new territory. The metrics speak for themselves. said Shanice, the CFO. She pulled up a presentation. Revenue down 12%. Client retention down 8%. Employee satisfaction at a 3-year low. And all of it correlating directly with changes in your personal life. Darnell looked at the numbers. They were worse than Marcus had shown him. How long have you been tracking this? 3 months. 3 months. They'd been watching him fail for 3 months and said nothing. Or maybe they had said something, and he'd been too distracted to hear it. Just like he'd been too distracted to hear Kael. I'm not asking you to step down permanently, Jerome said. Just temporarily. Until you stabilize your personal situation. And if I refuse, then we vote. And I'll be honest with you, Darnell, you don't have the numbers. The room stayed quiet. Darnell had built this empire on the principle that power was absolute. That authority couldn't be questioned without consequence. And now his own board was demonstrating that he'd been wrong. Power was only absolute as long as the people beneath you believed in your competence. He'd lost their belief. I'll step back, Darnell said. Voluntarily. For 90 days. The relief in the room was immediate. They'd been prepared for a fight. His surrender made everything easier. We appreciate your cooperation, Jerome said. I have conditions. The relief evaporated. What conditions? Marcus stays on as acting leader. No structural changes without my approval. And when I come back with full authority. Jerome looked at the others. Silent communication passed between them. Finally, he nodded. Agreed. Darnell stood. One more thing. The compliance concern that was filed. Who had access to it? It went to myself and Shanice. Why? Because it was filed by my spouse. And it contained information that should have been confidential. Darnell kept his voice level. I want to know if anyone else saw it before it reached you. Shanice pulled up her tablet. It came through proper channels. No unusual access logs. She paused. It was thorough, professionally documented. Honestly, it read like someone who understood operational management better than most of our senior team. Because Kael did understand it better. Had built most of their operational management protocols in the first place. Had been running them invisibly for years while Darnell took credit and stopped noticing who was actually doing the work. The meeting ended. Board members filed out, most of them avoiding eye contact. Only Jerome stayed behind. Can I give you some advice? He asked. Do I have a choice? Fix your marriage. Not for the board. For you. Jerome picked up his briefcase. I've watched you build this organization. You're brilliant, ruthless, effective. But you've been running on empty for months, and everyone can see it. Whatever's happening at home, resolve it. Because an empire isn't worth much if you're miserable running it. He left. Darnell sat alone in the boardroom, in the empire he'd built, temporarily removed from power because he'd forgotten that organizations are held together by people, not systems. At the hotel, Kael opened the door already knowing what had happened. Darnell could see it in his eyes. They asked you to step back, Kael said. I agreed to it. Something flickered across Kael's face. Not satisfaction, just acknowledgement. That was smart. Was this your plan all along? No. Kael moved to let him in. My plan was to protect Amari's inheritance. The board reaching their own conclusions about your leadership, that was just consequence. Darnell walked into the hotel room that had become more familiar than his own home over the past week. He'd been coming here every day, sitting with Kael for these strange, painful conversations that felt like marriage counseling and divorce proceedings happening simultaneously. I ended things with Nia, Darnell said. And the others. All of them. I know. She called me. That stopped Darnell cold. She called you? To tell me I'd won. To ask if I was happy. Kael sat down carefully, his hand moving to his belly where Amari was visibly moving. I told her there were no winners in this situation. Just people dealing with consequences. What did she say? That I was naive. That men like you don't change. Kael looked up. I told her she was probably right. The words hit harder than anger would have. This calm acceptance that Darnell was fundamentally incapable of transformation. It was worse than hatred. Hatred meant emotion. This was just resignation. "I'm changing," Darnell said. "You're adapting. That's different." "How?" "Adaptation is strategic. You're modifying behavior because your current approach isn't working. Change is fundamental. It's choosing to be different even when the old way would still succeed." Kael shifted, wincing slightly. "You're being faithful now because the board is watching and your revenue is down. That's adaptation. Change would be being faithful when everything was perfect and I'd never know if you weren't." Darnell sat down across from him. "How do I prove the difference?" "You don't. Not to me. Maybe to yourself." Kael's hand pressed against his belly. "Amari's moving a lot today. Dr. Chun says that's normal this late, but it makes it hard to sleep." The casual shift in conversation felt like whiplash. From discussing the fundamental nature of personal transformation to pregnancy updates. But Darnell recognized it for what it was, Kael creating distance, reminding them both that their connection now was just biology and paperwork. "Can I feel?" Darnell asked. Kael hesitated, then nodded. Darnell moved to sit beside him on the bed, placed his hand where Kael guided it, felt the movement under his palm, distinct, strong, undeniably real. His son, their son, the person who would exist in the world as proof that they'd once loved each other enough to create life. "He's strong," Darnell said quietly. "He has to be. He's going to have parents who love him but can't stand to be in the same room." Kael's voice was matter-of-fact. "That takes resilience." They sat like that for a moment, Darnell's hand on Kael's belly, feeling their son move, both of them acknowledging the weight of what they'd broken. "I was terrifying to everyone," Darnell said. "Except you." Kael looked at him. "You were never terrifying. You were just absent. That was scarier. I'm here now. For how long? Until the board reinstates you? Until your metrics improve." Kael moved Darnell's hand away gently. "I can't keep track of whether you're present because you want to be or because you're managing a crisis. What if it's both? Then it's still strategy." Darnell's phone buzzed. "Marcus." The restructuring was starting. High-risk divisions being sold. Violent operations being shut down. The empire being made smaller, cleaner, more sustainable. All the changes Darnell would have resisted 6 months ago because they would have looked like weakness. Now they just looked like survival. "I'm restructuring the organization," Darnell said. "Getting rid of the operations that required the most violence. The ones that made me into someone you couldn't recognize." Kael nodded slowly. "That's good. For you and for Amari. Not for us. There is no us. Not anymore." The finality should have been devastating. Instead, it just felt true. They'd ended months ago. They were just now filing the paperwork. "When's your next appointment?" Darnell asked. "Thursday, Dr. Chun wants to check my blood pressure again. Can I come?" Kael was quiet for so long Darnell thought he'd refuse. Then, "Yes, but you have to be on time. And you can't answer work calls during the appointment." "I won't." "You say that now." "I mean it." Kael looked at him with eyes that had learned not to trust promises. "We'll see." Darnell left the hotel knowing he'd been given a test. Show up on time. Be present. Prove through action that his words meant something. It should have been the easiest thing in the world. He'd negotiated multi-million-dollar deals, orchestrated complex operations, managed an empire. But showing up consistently for someone who'd learned to expect his absence, that was harder than any negotiation he'd ever handled. His phone rang. "Jerome, the restructuring is making news. Shareholders are nervous." "Let them be nervous." "Darnell, I'm not available for the next 2 hours. Handle it." He hung up. Stood on the sidewalk outside Kael's hotel. Made the choice to turn off his phone completely. Felt like stepping off a cliff. Or maybe like finally landing after years of falling without noticing. The weapons division sold for $40 million under market value because Darnell wouldn't negotiate on timeline. Gone in 3 weeks. The trafficking routes that had funded 30% of operations, shut down with adequate severance for everyone involved, no retaliation, no power plays. The enforcers who'd built reputations on violence, offered legitimate positions or clean exits with references. Marcus presented the final restructuring plan with the expression of someone watching a controlled demolition of everything they'd built together. "This is going to make us look weak," he said. "It's going to make us sustainable." Darnell signed off on the last division sale. "The violent branches were always going to get us killed or arrested. We're just accelerating the inevitable. The families are going to test you. They'll see this as opportunity. Let them." Marcus set down his tablet. "I don't recognize you anymore." "Good. The person you recognized was failing." The first test came from the West Side crew. They moved on territory that had been neutral for 6 years, expecting Darnell to respond with force. Instead, he called their leader directly. "I'm not interested in a war," Darnell said. Jamal, the West Side boss, laughed. "You going soft, Bishop?" "I'm going smart. You want that territory? Take it. I'll sell you the infrastructure for cost." Silence on the other end. "You serious?" "I'm restructuring. That territory was costing me more to maintain than it was generating. You want to deal with the headache? It's yours." "What's the catch?" "No catch. I'm getting out of the business that requires constant violence. You want to stay in it, that's your choice." The deal closed in 48 hours. Darnell took a loss on the infrastructure sale, made it back by not having to fund the security apparatus that territory required. The other families watched, confused, waiting for the trick. There was no trick. Darnell was just finally doing what Kael had been suggesting for years, making the organization profitable through efficiency rather than dominance. At the next doctor's appointment, Darnell arrived 20 minutes early. Sat in the waiting room reading parenting blogs on his phone, feeling like an anthropologist studying an alien culture. The blogs talked about sleep training and feeding schedules and developmental milestones. Darnell had run a criminal empire for 15 years. None of it had prepared him for the reality that he'd soon be responsible for keeping a tiny human alive. Kael arrived exactly on time, moving with the careful balance of someone in their 3rd trimester. He stopped when he saw Darnell in the waiting room. "You're early," he said. "You told me to be on time." "Early isn't on time. It's early." But there was something in Kael's voice. Not quite approval. Just acknowledgement that Darnell had heard the instruction and followed it. Dr. Chun called them back, examined Kael with practiced efficiency, asked questions about sleep and movement and pain levels. Darnell sat in the corner, staying quiet, being present without being intrusive. Learned that Kael's blood pressure was better, that Amari was measuring right on schedule, that everything was progressing normally despite the stress of the divorce. "Any questions?" Dr. Chun asked, looking between them. Kael glanced at Darnell. Some silent communication passed between them. "I have one," Darnell said. "When he's born, what happens in the first hour?" Dr. Chun smiled. "Depends on whether it's a vaginal birth or C-section, and whether there are complications. But typically, skin-to-skin contact with the birthing parent immediately. Then the other parent can hold him once we've done initial assessments." "How long is initial assessment?" 5 to 10 minutes usually. Darnell nodded, absorbing this. 5 to 10 minutes between his son being born and being allowed to hold him. Felt like an eternity and no time at all. In the parking lot afterward, Kael hesitated before getting into his car. "Thank you for coming," he said. "I said I would." "Yes, but you saying it and you doing it have historically been very different things." The observation was fair and hurt appropriately. "I'm trying." "I know." Kael's hand moved to his belly. "He's going to need you to keep trying, even when it's hard, even when work is demanding attention, even when there's some crisis that feels more urgent." "I will. We'll see." Kael drove away. Darnell stood in the parking lot, understanding that trust wasn't rebuilt through words. It was rebuilt through showing up consistently until the pattern of absence was replaced by a pattern of presence. His phone buzzed. 3 missed calls from board members. 2 urgent texts from Marcus. A voicemail from Jerome about shareholder concerns regarding the restructuring. Darnell looked at the notifications, then put his phone away, got in his car, drove to his penthouse that no longer felt like home. Inside, he started going through Kael's office methodically. Not to gather evidence or build a case. To understand. He found folders documenting every operational decision Kael had made over the years. Systems designed and implemented. Problems solved. Revenue generated. All of it quiet, invisible, completely essential. Found the pregnancy journal Kael had been keeping. Weekly entries documenting symptoms, fears, hopes. The entry from week 12 told Dee about the baby today. He said we'd adjust security. That's all. I wanted him to be scared or excited or something. Instead, he just made it logistical. Week 16. Went to the appointment alone again. The sonographer asked where my husband was. I said he was working. She looked at me with this pity that made me want to scream. I don't need pity. I need partnership. Week 24. Dr. Chun found something concerning with my blood pressure. Stress-related. She asked what I'm stressed about. I almost laughed. Where do I start? My husband is cheating. I'm building a divorce case. I'm pregnant and alone. But I just said work has been busy. She prescribed rest. As if rest is possible when you're trying to exit a marriage while protecting your unborn child's financial future. Darnell read every entry. Each one a window into the person he'd lived with for 7 years and apparently never really seen. By the time he finished, it was past midnight. He sat in Kael's office, surrounded by evidence of a full life he'd walked past every day without noticing. His phone rang. Marcus, the East Side family is making moves. They're testing whether you're really going peaceful. What kind of moves? Pushing on the boundaries. Seeing if you'll push back. Darnell thought about the old response. Show force. Make an example. Remind everyone why they feared him. Set up a meeting, he said instead. Neutral location. I'll talk to them. Talk? That's not. I'm not responding with violence unless absolutely necessary. If they want to discuss territory, we discuss it. If they want a war, they can have it with someone else. He hung up, understood that every choice now was being watched. The board, his organization, the other families, Kael. Everyone waiting to see if this change was real or just another strategy that would revert the moment he regained power. The meeting with the East Side family happened in a restaurant Darnell owned. Neutral ground in his territory, a show of confidence without aggression. Their boss, Rashad, arrived with 2 lieutenants. Darnell came alone. You've been making interesting choices, Rashad said after they'd ordered. I'm restructuring. That's one word for it. Others are saying you're weak. Let them. Rashad studied him. I knew you'd end up here eventually. This life, it ages you in dog years. Most of us don't make it to retirement. We get killed or arrested first. I'm not retiring. No, but you're getting smart. Transitioning to legitimate operations before the feds decide to make an example of you. Rashad cut into his steak. Can't say I blame you. I've been thinking about similar moves. Then let's talk about it. What do you need? They spent 2 hours discussing territory redistribution, infrastructure sales, transitioning contacts from illegal to legal operations. By the end, they'd sketched out an arrangement that would benefit both organizations without requiring violence. Your reputation is going to take a hit, Rashad said. People are going to think you've lost your edge. My edge was heading toward federal prosecution or assassination. I'd rather lose reputation than lose freedom. Your husband teach you that? Darnell looked up sharply. What? Kael. He's been telling you to go legitimate for years. I remember him at that charity event 3 years ago, talking about building sustainable operations instead of extractive ones. Made a lot of sense. Everyone ignored him because he was soft-spoken and obviously more interested in infrastructure than power. How do you know that? Because I listened. Unlike you, apparently. Rashad stood, signaling the meeting was over. He's a smart man. You should have paid attention earlier. After Rashad left, Darnell sat in the empty restaurant, understanding that even his rivals had noticed Kael more than he had. His phone buzzed. Kael. Dr. Chun moved up my next appointment. She wants to check something. Can you be there Wednesday at 2 p.m.? Yes. Don't promise if you can't commit. I'll be there. 3 days felt like a lifetime to prove he meant it. Darnell cleared his Wednesday schedule, told Marcus he was unavailable. Put it in writing to the board that he had a personal commitment that superseded any business crisis. When Wednesday came, he arrived 30 minutes early, sat in the waiting room, turned off his phone completely, and waited for his husband to arrive so he could be present for whatever medical concern had prompted the early appointment. It felt like the smallest thing and the most important thing he'd done in months. The boardroom was standing room only. Word had spread that Darnell Bishop was facing final review, and half the organization had found reasons to attend. Some to support, most to watch what happened when power finally acknowledged its limits. Jerome called the session to order with the kind of formality that meant this was already decided. They were just performing the ritual. We're here to review operational performance during the 90-day transition period, he began, and to determine whether reinstatement of full leadership authority is appropriate. Shanice pulled up the metrics. Revenue had stabilized, not recovered to previous levels, but stopped declining. Operational efficiency had actually improved in several divisions. Client satisfaction was up. The restructuring had cost them territory and reputation, but gained them sustainability and reduced legal exposure. The numbers suggest that the organizational changes have been beneficial, Shanice said carefully. However, we remain concerned about leadership stability during ongoing personal circumstances. Meaning, Darnell asked, meaning your divorce is still pending. Your child is due in 3 weeks. These are significant personal stressors that may impact judgment. They may. They also might improve it. Jerome leaned forward. How do you figure? Because I'm learning to be present instead of just powerful. That's making me a better leader. The room got quiet. This kind of admission, vulnerability dressed as growth, wasn't typical Darnell Bishop behavior. Explain, Jerome said. Before Darnell could respond, the conference room door opened. Kael walked in, 8.5 months pregnant, moving slowly but deliberately. He was dressed in one of those expensive maternity suits that managed to look professional despite the obvious belly. Everyone turned to stare. I apologize for interrupting, Kael said, but I was informed this meeting would determine the organization's leadership structure. Since I filed the original compliance concern, I felt I should be present for the resolution. Jerome looked at Darnell. Did you know he was coming? No. Kael took a seat near the back. Darnell couldn't read his expression. Didn't know if this was support or preparation to finish what the divorce papers had started. Continue, Jerome said to Darnell. Darnell stood, addressed the room but kept awareness of Kael in his peripheral vision. 3 months ago, you asked me to step back because my personal life was affecting my professional judgment. You were right. I was failing as a leader because I was failing as a partner and didn't even realize it. I'd built this organization on the principle that power meant never showing weakness, that competence meant handling everything alone, that leadership meant being feared more than trusted. He pulled up his own presentation. Here's what I learned during the transition. Operations run better when decisions are distributed instead of centralized. Revenue is more stable when we focus on sustainability instead of expansion. Client relationships are stronger when we prioritize reliability over aggression. Everything I thought made us powerful was actually making us fragile. Shanice was taking notes. Jerome's expression was carefully neutral. The restructuring cost us 30% of our revenue, Darnell continued, but it reduced our legal exposure by 60% and our operational costs by 40%. We're smaller, but we're stronger. And we got here because I finally started listening to advice I'd been ignoring for years. Whose advice? Asked Council Member Davis. Darnell looked directly at Kael. My husband's. who's been telling me to focus on sustainable operations instead of territorial expansion since year 2 of our marriage, who designed most of our current infrastructure, who I stopped listening to because I confused quiet competence with irrelevance. Kael's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes shifted. Which brings me to a proposal, Darnell said. Reinstate my authority, but restructure the leadership model. Create a formal advisory position with operational oversight. Someone who can catch systemic problems before they become crises. You have an advisory board, Jerome pointed out. I need someone who understands how the infrastructure actually works, not just how it looks on paper. And who did you have in mind? Before Darnell could answer, Kael stood up, slowly using the chair for balance. The room's attention shifted to him completely. May I speak? He asked. Jerome nodded. Kael moved to the front of the room, stood beside Darnell but not touching, creating this visible distance that everyone could read. I filed the compliance concern because I was protecting my son's inheritance, Kael said. His voice was calm, clear, the tone of someone who'd spent years speaking in rooms that didn't want to listen. But I was also documenting a pattern I'd been watching for years. This organization runs on brilliance and intimidation. That works until it doesn't. And when it stops working, everything collapses fast. He pulled out his own tablet. These are the operational failures I documented over the past 6 months. These are the ones I prevented in the 6 months before that. Notice the correlation? When I was actively managing systems, problems got solved before they became public. When I stopped, everything surfaced simultaneously. The board members were leaning forward now, actually listening. I'm not saying this to take credit, Kael continued. I'm saying it because this organization has a structural problem. It depends too heavily on individual competence instead of distributed systems. When any single person steps back, whether that's Darnell or myself or Marcus, the whole thing destabilizes. That's not sustainable. He pulled up a proposal. This is a restructuring plan I've been developing. It distributes operational oversight across multiple roles, creates redundancy so that no single person is essential, builds accountability so that problems surface earlier. And it makes the organization significantly less dependent on Darnell's daily decision-making, which means he can actually focus on strategic direction instead of crisis management. The room was completely silent. I'm submitting this for consideration, Kael said. Not because I want a position here. I'm done with this organization after my son is born. But I don't want Amari inheriting something unstable. So either implement something like this, or accept that you're one personal crisis away from another operational collapse. He set down his tablet, looked at Darnell directly for the first time since entering the room. And for the record, Kael added, his voice quieter now, Darnell is a brilliant strategist and a natural leader. His problem was never competence. It was presence. He was so busy running an empire that he forgot to notice the people holding it together. If he's learned that lesson, actually learned it, not just performed learning it, then he's more qualified to lead now than he was 3 months ago. Then Kael walked out, slowly, one hand pressed to his lower back, moving like someone whose body was preparing for major transformation. The room stayed silent for a solid 30 seconds after the door closed. Finally, Jerome spoke. That was illuminating. He's right, Shanice said, already pulling up Kael's proposal on her own tablet. This restructuring plan is solid. Better than solid. It's what we should have implemented years ago. It's also going to cost you direct control, Davis pointed out to Darnell. This distributes power you currently hold personally. Good, Darnell said. Concentrated power is what got us here. I'd rather have sustainable success than absolute authority. Jerome looked at the other board members. Silent communication passed between them. Finally, he nodded. We'll vote on 2 proposals. First, reinstatement of Darnell's full authority. Second, implementation of the structural changes outlined in the document Kael just presented. All in favor of reinstatement. Unanimous. All in favor of restructuring? Also unanimous. Jerome smiled slightly. Congratulations. You're back in charge of an organization that's about to look very different than when you left it. The meeting dissolved. Board members surrounded Darnell, some offering congratulations, others already discussing implementation timelines for the restructuring. But Darnell was moving toward the door, following the path Kael had taken. He found him in the parking garage, sitting in his car with the door open, breathing carefully. "Are you okay?" Darnell asked. Braxton Hicks contractions. Dr. Chun said they'd get more frequent this close to the due date. Kael's hand was pressed to his belly. "They're not real labor, just practice." Darnell crouched beside the car. "That was unexpected. You coming to the meeting?" "I know. I wasn't planning to." Kael's breathing evened out. "But then I realized if I didn't speak up, you'd propose giving me some role in the organization. And I don't want that. I'm done being invisible support for your empire." "I know. Do you?" "Because you just got your power back and the first thing you tried to do was offer me a position that would keep me connected to you professionally." "That wasn't—" Darnell stopped. "Okay, maybe it was. But not because I want to control you. Because you're genuinely the most qualified person to implement that restructuring. Then hire someone else who's qualified. Someone who wants the job. Someone who doesn't have 7 years of resentment built up from being taken for granted." The words landed heavy. "True. Undeniable. You defended me in there," Darnell said. "I defended the truth. That's different." Kael started to close the car door. "Congratulations on getting reinstated. I hope you actually mean the changes you're promising." "Kael, I have a doctor's appointment in 30 minutes. I need to go." Darnell stepped back, watched Kael drive away, stood in the parking garage understanding that even vindication wasn't reconciliation. His phone buzzed. "Marcus. The board approved everything. Both proposals. You're officially back, and we're officially restructuring." "Good. You don't sound happy about it." "I just got everything I thought I wanted, and it doesn't feel like winning." "That's called growth," Marcus said. "Uncomfortable, isn't it?" Darnell hung up, went back upstairs, spent the rest of the day in meetings about implementation timelines and structural changes. Every decision felt weighted now, every choice visible. That night, alone in his penthouse, he read through Kael's restructuring proposal again. Really read it this time, seeing not just the operational changes but the philosophy underneath. Distributed power, built-in redundancy, systems that valued collaboration over dominance. Everything Kael had been trying to teach him for years. His phone rang. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer. "This is Dr. Chun," the voice said. "I'm calling about Kael. He's in labor. Early labor but progressing. He listed you as someone to notify." Darnell was moving before she finished the sentence. "Which hospital?" She told him. He was out the door in seconds, leaving his phone, his wallet, everything except his keys. Drove faster than was safe or legal. Parked in the emergency zone and ran inside. Found Dr. Chun at the nurse's station. She looked unsurprised to see him. "He's in room 412, she said. "But Darnell, he's scared. And he doesn't want to look scared. So don't make this about you being worried. Make it about him feeling supported." Darnell nodded. Walked to room 412 feeling like he was approaching the most important negotiation of his life, except there was nothing to negotiate. Just reality arriving 3 weeks early, whether any of them were ready or not. He knocked, heard Kael's voice, tight with pain, say, "Come in," and stepped inside to meet the future they'd made together, ready or not. Kael was sitting on the edge of the hospital bed, hands gripping the rails, breathing through a contraction with the kind of focused intensity Darnell had seen him use during crisis management. Dr. Chun stood beside him, timing something on her watch. 45 seconds, she said. "Good. You're doing great." The contraction passed. Kael looked up, saw Darnell standing in the doorway. "You came," he said. "Not grateful, just observing. You're having our son. Where else would I be?" Handling the board transition, restructuring the organization, running your empire. Kael's voice was level despite the circumstances. Those all seemed more important than me for the past 7 months. The accusation landed exactly where it was meant to. Dr. Chun glanced between them. I'm going to check on your labs, she said diplomatically. I'll be back in 20 minutes. She left. Darnell moved closer but didn't touch. Didn't presume permission. How long have you been in labor? He asked. Contractions started around noon. I thought they were more Braxton Hicks until about an hour ago when my water broke. Kael's hand moved to his belly. He's early. 3 weeks early. Dr. Chun says that's not dangerous at this stage, but they're monitoring closely. Darnell nodded, absorbing this. His son was being born 3 weeks ahead of schedule, and Kael had been in labor for hours before calling anyone. Why didn't you call me sooner? Because I wasn't sure you'd come. And I didn't want to be disappointed today of all days. Another contraction started. Kael's whole body tensed. I don't have energy for disappointment right now. Darnell watched him breathe through it. Watched him manage pain the same way he managed everything. Quietly, competently, without asking for help. And finally understood what Kael had been trying to tell him for months. When the contraction passed, Darnell said, I'm not leaving, even if you tell me to. Even if you don't want me here. I'm staying until our son is born and after. I'm not missing this. Kael looked at him with eyes that had learned not to trust promises. You say that now. I know. And I know my words don't mean much anymore. So I'm not going to keep talking. I'm just going to stay. He pulled up a chair, sat down, put his phone on silent and set it aside. They stayed like that for the next 4 hours. Darnell being present without being intrusive. Kael laboring with the kind of focus that made every contraction look like a problem he was systematically solving. Dr. Chun checked in periodically, adjusting monitors, asking questions, reassuring them that everything was progressing normally. Around hour 6, the contractions got closer together. Harder. Kael's breathing changed, became more vocal, less controlled. I need the epidural now, he said. I know I said I'd wait, but I changed my mind. Completely normal, Dr. Chun said. I'll get the anesthesiologist. The epidural took 20 minutes to place and another 20 to take full effect. Kael relaxed visibly once the pain medication kicked in. His shoulders dropping, his breathing evening out. Better? Darnell asked. Much. Kael's eyes were heavy now, exhaustion catching up. Thank you for staying. I told you I would. I know. But you told me a lot of things that turned out not to be true. He said it without anger. Just fact. I'm too tired to hope this time is different. So I'm just accepting that you're here now and not thinking about after. The honesty was worse than accusation. Darnell sat beside him, watching monitors display information he didn't fully understand, feeling more helpless than he'd ever felt running an empire. Can I hold your hand? He asked. Kael looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. Darnell took his hand carefully, felt how much smaller it was than his own. How all these years he'd been holding this hand and never really paying attention to what it felt like. They stayed like that while Kael dozed between contractions. Dr. Chun came back, checked his progress, nodded with satisfaction. You're at 8 centimeters, she said. Should be ready to push within the hour. Darnell felt his stomach drop. That fast. First babies usually take longer, but Kael's body apparently knows what it's doing. She looked at him directly. Are you planning to be in the room for delivery? Darnell looked at Kael, who was watching him with that same careful neutrality. If he'll let me, Darnell said. Do you want him here? Dr. Chun asked Kael. Kael was quiet for so long Darnell prepared himself for rejection. Then, yes, but only if you stay at my head. I don't want you seeing the actual birth. That's too intimate for where we are right now. The boundary was clear. Darnell nodded. Whatever you want. At hour 7 Dr. Chun said it was time. Nurses appeared with equipment. The room reorganized itself around the biology of what was about to happen. Kael was moved into position, and Darnell stayed exactly where he'd been told. At his head, holding his hand, being present without being intrusive. When I tell you to push, you push for 10 seconds, Dr. Chun instructed. Then rest, then push again. We'll keep going until he's here. The pushing started. Kael gripped Darnell's hand hard enough to hurt. Made sounds Darnell had never heard him make. Raw animal, completely unguarded. Between contractions, he gasped for air, his face flushed with effort. You're doing amazing, Darnell said. Meant it. Don't patronize me, Kael gasped. I'm not. You're the strongest person I've ever met. You're just realizing that now? No. I'm just finally saying it out loud. Another push. Another. Dr. Chun was saying things about crowning and one more big push. Then suddenly there was a cry, thin, outraged, absolutely perfect. He's here, Dr. Chun said. 10 fingers, 10 toes, good color, strong cry. Dad, wanna cut the cord? It took Darnell a second to realize she meant him. He moved where she indicated, cut where she showed him. Hands shaking more than they'd ever shaken during any deal or negotiation or crisis. They cleaned the baby quickly. Amari, their son, this person who hadn't existed until 90 seconds ago, then placed him on Kael's chest. Kael's arms came around him immediately, instinctive and sure. Hi, Kael whispered. Hi, baby, I'm your parent. I've been waiting to meet you. Darnell stood there, watching this person he'd married hold this person they'd made, and felt something crack open in his chest. Not breaking, opening, like a door that had been locked finally giving way. Do you want to hold him? Kael asked after a few minutes. If you're ready. Kael transferred Amari carefully. Darnell took him. This tiny warm weight that smelled like metal and blood and something he couldn't name. His son. Their son. The person who would exist in the world as proof that they'd once loved each other enough to create life. Amari opened his eyes. Unfocused, searching. Already trying to make sense of the world he'd just entered. Hey, Darnell said quietly. I'm your father. I'm gonna try really hard not to mess this up. Kael was watching them. Darnell couldn't read his expression. You can sit, Kael said, gesturing to the bed. Carefully. Darnell sat beside him, both of them looking at Amari. Outside the window, the city was doing what it always did. Moving, changing, completely indifferent to the fact that everything inside this room had just transformed. Thank you, Darnell said. For what? For carrying him. For doing this alone when I should have been here. For letting me be present now even though I don't deserve it. Kael was quiet for a moment. You're his father. That's not about deserving. That's just biology and responsibility. And us? There is no us. Not like before. Kael's voice was gentle but firm. We're going to be good co-parents. We're going to raise our son in 2 homes where he's loved and supported. We're going to be kind to each other because that's what's best for him. But we're not getting back together. The words should have been devastating. Instead, they just felt honest. Okay, Darnell said. Okay. If that's what you need, then okay. I'll prove I've changed through how I show up for him. For both of you. Not through words or promises. Just through being present consistently until the pattern is undeniable. Kael looked at him with eyes that had learned not to trust easily. We'll see. They sat like that for another hour. Taking turns holding Amari. Watching him sleep and wake and make the tiny sounds newborns make. Not talking much. Just existing in this strange space between who they'd been and who they were becoming. Dr. Chun came back, checked on Kael, pronounced everything healthy and normal. You can both stay tonight if you want, she said. We have a larger room available. Kael looked at Darnell, some question passing between them. If you want me to stay, I'll stay, Darnell said. If you want space, I'll come back in the morning. Kael was quiet for a long moment. Then, you can stay, just for tonight, because Amari should have both his parents here for his first night. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't reconciliation. It was just an opening. Small. Provisional. More than Darnell deserved and exactly what Amari needed. Thank you, Darnell said. They were moved to the larger room. Amari slept in his bassinet between them. Kael dozed, exhausted from labor. And Darnell sat in the uncomfortable hospital chair, watching his son breathe, understanding that this was what mattered. Not empires, not territory, not reputation. This, being present when the people you loved needed you. Showing up consistently until trust could be rebuilt. Choosing connection over control. Amari stirred, making small noises. Darnell picked him up carefully, held him against his chest, felt the tiny heartbeat against his own. "I'm going to do better," he whispered. "For you and for him. I'm going to be the father you deserve and the partner he needed me to be." Amari yawned, completely unimpressed by promises. Darnell understood that. Words were cheap. Only consistency mattered. So he held his son and watched the city lights and made the choice to be present for every moment after this one. Whether or not it led to reconciliation, whether or not Kael ever forgave him. Some things you did because they were right, not because they led to the outcome you wanted. He was finally learning that. Before the divorce papers arrived, Kael had already left. Not physically, but in every way that mattered. He'd stopped expecting Darnell to remember the small things. Stopped hoping for attention that felt chosen rather than obligated. Stopped believing that love was enough when presence was absent. 8 months later, Kael stood in his new apartment. Smaller than the penthouse, cheaper, infinitely more his, holding Amari while he slept. The baby monitor sat on the counter next to divorce papers that had been signed and filed and finalized 3 weeks ago. The marriage was legally over. The family was just beginning. Darnell came by every Tuesday and Friday for his scheduled time. He was never late, never distracted, never tried to renegotiate the boundaries Kael had established. He'd sit on the floor and let Amari grab his fingers. He'd read picture books in that deep voice that made their son's eyes go wide. He'd help with bottles and diapers and the mundane labor of keeping a tiny human alive. And he never once asked Kael to reconsider the divorce. "He's getting bigger," Darnell said one Friday evening, holding Amari up to examine him like he was studying important data. "Babies do that. His eyes are changing. They look more like yours now." Kael smiled slightly. "The pediatrician says they might change again. Eye color doesn't settle until around 6 months. They'd gotten good at this. Parallel parenting with careful boundaries. Cordial without being intimate. Coexisting in Amari's life without trying to reconstruct the marriage that had ended. The organization is doing well," Darnell offered. "The restructuring you proposed. It's working better than expected. That's good. They want to hire you as a consultant. You'd set your own hours, work remotely, just troubleshoot systems when problems arise." "I'm not interested." "I know. I told them that. They asked me to ask anyway." Darnell shifted Amari to his other arm. "They're willing to pay significantly more than market rate. It's not about money. I know. It's about not wanting to be connected to something that hurt you." Kael looked at him in surprise. Darnell meeting him with that kind of accurate understanding was new. Or maybe it wasn't new. Maybe Darnell was finally paying enough attention to see what had always been there. "I'm building something separate," Kael said. "Consulting for smaller organizations that need infrastructure design. The slower, less prestigious. But it's mine." "That's good. You should have things that are yours." They fell into comfortable silence. Amari dozed between them, oblivious to the complicated adult emotions surrounding his existence. "Can I ask you something?" Darnell said eventually. "Depends on what it is. Did you ever think we'd end up here? Not married anymore but both in his life. Getting along but not together." Kael considered the question. "Honestly, I thought you'd fight the divorce harder. Try to negotiate or manipulate or use some strategy to change my mind. I thought about it. But you didn't. Because you were right. I needed to prove change through action, not through convincing you to give me another chance before I'd earned it." Darnell looked at him directly. "So that's what I'm doing. Being present for Amari. Being respectful of your boundaries. showing up consistently until the pattern is undeniable. And then what? Then nothing. This isn't a long strategy to win you back. This is just me being the co-parent and person I should have been all along. Kael studied him, looking for deception or hidden agenda. Found nothing but tired honesty. You really have changed, he said quietly. Some. Still working on it. Darnell smiled slightly. Turns out unlearning 34 years of prioritizing control over connection is harder than running a criminal empire. Former criminal empire. You're mostly legitimate now. Mostly. Darnell stood, transferred Amari back to Kael carefully. I should go. Let you get him to bed. You can stay for dinner if you want. I made too much anyway. The offer surprised them both. Kael hadn't extended anything beyond scheduled parenting time in months. Darnell recognized it for what it was, not an opening toward reconciliation, just an acknowledgement that maybe they could be friendly co-parents instead of just functional ones. I'd like that, Darnell said. Thank you. They ate together while Amari slept in his bassinet. Talked about parenting challenges and funny things their son had done. Avoided discussing anything deeper than surface logistics. It was comfortable in a way their marriage had never been. No expectations, no disappointments, just two people trying to raise a child well. When Darnell left that night, Kael stood at the window watching him walk to his car. Thought about the man he'd married versus the man who'd just spent 3 hours helping him fold tiny laundry and discussing sleep training methods. They weren't the same person. This version was quieter, more present, less certain of his own rightness. Kael didn't know if it was permanent change or temporary adaptation. Didn't know if 6 months from now Darnell would revert to old patterns or continue building new ones. But for the first time in years, he wasn't responsible for managing that uncertainty. He'd built a life separate from Darnell's choices. Had created stability that didn't depend on whether someone else showed up. Felt like freedom. His phone buzzed. Darnell, thank you for letting me stay for dinner. And for everything you're doing to make co-parenting work. I know it's not easy. Kael typed back, you're welcome. See you Tuesday. He set down the phone. Looked at Amari sleeping peacefully. Thought about the future they were building. Not the one he'd planned when he married Darnell, but the one they were creating now. Separate homes. Shared custody. Mutual respect without romance. It wasn't the love story he'd imagined. But it was honest. Sustainable. Built on who they actually were rather than who they'd hoped to be. And maybe that was enough. Outside his window, the city continued its evening routine. Somewhere in it, Darnell was driving back to his penthouse. Somewhere else, the organization they'd built together was running on the systems Kael had designed. Somewhere in the future, Amari would grow up with 2 parents who loved him but couldn't stay married to each other. Before the divorce papers arrived, Kael had already left. Not because Darnell had cheated, not because the love had died, but because he'd refused to raise their son in a house where love felt borrowed. Now he was raising Amari in a home where love was abundant, present, chosen every day, and Darnell was finally arriving, not to the marriage they'd lost, but to the partnership they were building. Co-parents, friends, 2 people who'd learned the hard way that presence matters more than promises. Kael picked up Amari, held him close, whispered against his soft hair. We're going to be okay, both of us, better than okay. And for the first time in years, he believed it. Thank you for watching this story unfold. If it touched you, inspired you, or made you think differently about love, loss, and the long road to becoming the person you need to be, please subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. We have more stories like this coming, stories about real struggles and hard-won growth. Share your thoughts in the comments. Your perspective might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. Together, we build a community that inspires and supports each other through the complicated work of being human. See you in the next story.